Good morning. Welcome, everyone, to the inaugural Asan China Forum. It's wonderful to have you all here. Thanks for making, especially all of you from overseas, from abroad, making it to this bitter cold Seoul. But today, actually, we have about 70 experts from China, and we have experts from 17 other countries also participating. So we have altogether about 200 people participating in this forum. We titled this inaugural forum China in Transition, but I think it's not just China. We're all in transition in one way or another. We started this year with political transitions I think Taiwan started it off, and then Russia, and now in a couple of days, Japan, right? Before, of course, we have our own political transition here in South Korea. I think it's really incumbent on all of us here to really try to formulate the policies and inform the public so as to ensure a smoother transition everywhere it's taking place. Now it gives me great pleasure to introduce someone very, very special, our founder, and honorary chairman of the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, Dr. Chung Mong-jun. Dr. Chung is a seventh-term National Assemblyman, making him the most senior member of the National Assembly. Not in terms of age, but in terms of his term, he's certainly the most senior member. He's actually taken a time out of his very, very busy schedule. He's actually the chairman of the Presidential Election Commission for the ruling Saenuri Party. So even this early morning, he was out there campaigning in this bitter cold. But now he's joined us. And so I would like to ask him to make a few opening welcome remarks for all of you. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Chung Mong-jun.
네, 안녕하십니까. 반갑습니다. 추운 아침에 이렇게 오시느라고 수고가 많으셨습니다. 함재봉 원장께서 중국의 전문가고 또 중국말을 잘해서 앞으로 이렇게 좋은 중국 관련 회의를 자주 기대해도 될 것 같습니다. 우리 함재봉 원장에서 박수 한번 쳐주시죠. 고맙습니다. 양해해 주시면 제가 영어로 준비된 원고를 간략히 말씀드리도록 하겠습니다. 니하오 훈가오싱 지엔니, 이거 한 박사가 가르쳐 준 겁니다. Well, good morning. Welcome to the Asan China Forum. Let me start with a joke about how important China has become in global affairs. President Obama offered bailout money to keep Greece from defaulting on its loans. When Greece thanked him, Obama said, "Don't mention it to China because it's their money." This morning, please allow me to focus my remarks on Korea-China relations. My first visit to China was in January 1993. During my visit to the Museum of the Chinese Revolution in Tiananmen Square, I saw a young couple with a small boy who was about 3-4 years old. The weather was very cold, but the couple left the child outside the museum while they went inside the museum. At the entrance, the child was alone and eating uncooked ramen for his survival. I was born in 1951 during the Korean War. The child, whom I met at the museum entrance, reminded me of my childhood trying to survive after the war. In my case, after the war, when Korea was the poorest country in the world. As you see this morning, I am now 61, alive and healthy. I expect that long before the child turns my age, he will be living in a country just as prosperous as South Korea today. This year marks the 20th anniversary of normalization of relations between South Korea and China. China is South Korea's largest trading partner, and South Korea is China's third largest. There are more than 200 flights per day between our two countries. More than 60,000 Chinese students study in South Korea, and an equal number of South Korean students study in China. Despite these exchanges, and despite the fact that our relationship has been elevated to strategic cooperative partnership, there are not only diplomatic tensions in Korea-China relations, but also tensions on a more popular level. I still remember the football match between China and Turkey during the 2002 FIFA World Cup tournament held in Korea. Please allow me to talk about sports. Sports is very important. 2002 was the year that celebrated the 10th anniversary of Korea-China normalization. It was the first World Cup tournament held on the Asian continent and the first time that Chinese national team was qualified for the tournament. So I had hoped, and many Chinese also hoped, the occasion would bring our two countries closer together. However, to my chagrin, during the China-Turkey football match, most of the South Korean fans cheered for the Turkish team, not the Chinese. After the match, Chinese press became critical of everything about the football festival. I felt sorry and concerned. When I visited Beijing after the World Cup, I met with a member of Politburo's standing committee. Although I did not bring up the issue, he told me with a smile that Chinese government had not instructed the press. Why don't you laugh? He smiled. There were more serious incidents as well. China's so-called Northeast Project reinterpreted the history of the ancient Korean kingdom of Goguryeo as ethnically Chinese. The project is an affront to the Korean sense of identity. During his speech to Korean National Assembly in 2005, President Hu Jintao said, "This year marks the 60th anniversary of our victory in the anti-fascist war." He also said, "We consistently believe that the peninsula issue must ultimately be resolved through dialogue and negotiations between South and North Korea." We understood what he was trying to say, but the terminology and logic was strikingly similar to those used by North Korea in demanding the dissolution of the Korea-US military alliance. In 2008, during President Lee Myung-bak's visit to China, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesman said the US-Korea military alliance is something left over from history. Such remarks led to concerns in our bilateral relations. It may be true that the Korea-US alliance is something left over from history. So are the North Korean regime and the division of the Korean peninsula. Today, many North Korean defectors in China are repatriated to North Korea against their will. We feel responsible but helpless in the face of this situation. I hope that China can do more to better protect the rights of North Korean refugees. South Korean-China relation is complex and continue to evolve rapidly. When I met Mr. Wang Jiarui, director of the International Department of the CCP, before Beijing Olympic. He told me he watched 42 episodes, 42 editions of the Korean drama 대장금. Actually, I did not watch any of the drama in Korea. Korea and China share centuries of civilization based on Buddhism and Confucianism. We have maintained friendly relations over centuries. It was over a few decades that relations were not that good. This is why I'm optimistic that we can build a lasting relationship based on shared values and ideals of peace, human rights, and respect for international norms. I hope that discussions of the Asan China Forum today and tomorrow can provide us with an intellectual base for a more prosperous, harmonious, and peaceful community in Northeast Asia. Thank you very much. 谢谢，再见。
Thank you very much, Dr. Chung. He has to go off to campaign again. So thank you again. Now I have the pleasure of introducing to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Bill Overholt. There's definitely a personal connection to everything. Bill is the one who had hired me to RAND when I was from USC. And he opened up a new vista for me and actually a great preparation for running a think tank. RAND was the first place where I really learned what a think tank was all about. I don't think he needs much of an introduction, but just for those, especially the younger generation here, who don't really know him, he's one of the rare. In social sciences, we say that there is no enfant terrible, but I think he definitely qualifies as one. He was one of the proteges of Herman Kahn, one of those whiz kids. He helped in founding the Hudson Institute. He's a political scientist by training, but he went into banking, and he lived in Asia for 18 years. And he has this rare combination of being able to combine political analysis with really in-depth financial and economic knowledge, especially of the region. And he always does a marvelous job of combining that to provide a very rich discussion, analysis of the affairs in this region that I've benefited a lot from. And so please join me in welcoming Dr. Bill Overholt.
Thanks, Chaibong, for that generous introduction. I'll try to live up to 10% of it. It's such a pleasure to be back at an Asan Institute Forum and see so many friends here. It's both an honor and humbling to see so many people who've contributed so much to the development of this region. I decided that the right approach to a keynote talk here was not to go through a laundry list of individual issues that might or might not change as leaderships change. I think you've seen a few hundred articles by leading journalists on that subject. I think we need a deeper look. On some levels, very little has changed over the years in U.S.-China relations. U.S. policy since Nixon under Democrats and Republicans and different kinds of Democrats and Republicans has basically remained to welcome China into the international system, provide the economic opening that allows China to experience such wonderful growth while hedging against the possibility that something might go wrong. And likewise, China has steadily opened itself to the world, joined the major international institutions, positioned its economy in a way that, for all the controversies, has stimulated the economies of its neighbors, tremendously helped get growth really moving in the resource-producing countries of Africa and Latin America, and stimulated the whole world. Today's challenges don't seem particularly burdensome compared with the challenges of the past. We have more controversies over the South China Sea, but much less tension over Taiwan. I think that with changes coming in the balance of the Chinese economy, we're going to see a lot of these issues like currency fade very quickly. Other issues will take their place, but those issues will not individually create dangerous challenges. And having said these pretty optimistic things, there's a downward cycle of distrust in Chinese-American relations that, if it continues, will be dangerous. And I'd like to explore what I think are the deepest reasons for this. Now, let me go back to the beginning of the post-World War II period, and I want to argue that we've experienced an era of good feeling based on new global conditions, but that that era of good feeling is at risk. What are those new conditions? After World War II, two fundamental things changed. One economic, one military. We learned from the Japanese experience that it's possible to grow 10% a year. The British Empire was based on 2% annual growth for several centuries. The American position in the world today is based on a little over 3% annual growth on average. Meiji Japan managed 4% for a while but couldn't sustain it. Suddenly, a set of new social technologies developed, starting in Japan. And Japan became a big power, with its military very constrained by a U.S. written constitution. The U.S. was terrified in the late 70s and the 80s that Japan was taking over the world. George Friedman wrote a book, and many others wrote similar things, The Coming War with Japan. The lesson was you can become the third most important power in the world through just economic growth. South Korea was the first to follow that lesson. General Park Chung-hee took over in South Korea, slashed the military budget, in the most threatened country on earth and put everything into economic development, abandoning the policies of Syngman Rhee, who, like his northern counterparts, was putting everything into the military and was falling farther and farther behind North Korea. Also abandoning the policies of Jang Myung, who bet everything on democracy. And it didn't work very well. And over a period of time, South Korea's economy became 20 to 30 times larger than what had been a militarily superior North Korea, an economically superior North Korea, and a politically more stable North Korea. One of the most powerful lessons in human history. The other thing that changed after World War II was the incredible destructive power of modern weaponry. If a country tried to rise in the old way, the way that had worked for millennia, invading its neighbors, taxing their peasants, selling off their golden temples, didn't work so well anymore because you only got Pyrrhic victories under most circumstances. And nuclear weapons were just part of this. Conventional weaponry is now vastly more powerful. And two other things have happened to conventional weapons. It's become democratized. Anybody can go out and build IEDs and conduct cyber war. And it's become depersonalized. You can you can blow up vast numbers of people and not be there, not take any personal risk. For reasons I go through in a paper but won't analyze here, the democratization and the depersonalization are multipliers of the effect of greater violence. So there's a huge incentive now to change the balance, focus more on economic development, less on the military. Doesn't mean the military is unimportant. The military remains vitally important. The balance of the tools you use needs to change in the modern world. And it was not just Indonesia and South Korea, but in Southeast Asia. Indonesia, under Sukarno, claimed essentially all of Southeast Asia and mismanaged the economy horribly. In came Suharto, gave up most of the claims outside of core Indonesia, focused on economic growth. This was the most diverse, divided country on earth. It had the third largest communist party in the world. It had more Muslim fundamentalist terrorists and people insisting on a Muslim state than the whole rest of the world combined. And as soon as Suharto became successful with his program, all that was over. And Indonesia became peacefully the leader of Southeast Asia. The biggest beneficiary of this trend was in many ways the United States. When you read the history of the Cold War, you read so much about the military balances. When you look at what happened, the United States started with the Marshall Plan in Europe. The game was revitalize the economies and polities of Western Europe and protect that with the military. And in Asia was rebuild Japan, rebuild South Korea, build Indonesia and Thailand, and protect that with the military. If we had used primarily military means to try to suppress unrest in Indonesia, to try to contain Indonesian ambitions, we would have failed completely. That's a problem that's 25 times the problem of Iraq. But an economic strategy protected by the military, implemented worldwide, was tremendously successful. So we had a series of peaceful rises, to use Zheng Bijian's phrase. But I started writing about not using that phrase, but this phenomenon more than 30 years ago. Actually, in 1972, in a paper for the Pentagon, where I argued that the great economic takeoff in Asia that I alleged was about to happen would be more important than the Vietnam War, more important than things like Mafalindo and ASPAC and ASEAN in winning the Cold War. At the time, people laughed. So the United States contributed to these peaceful rises, it protected them, and it achieved victory through them. You won't find that in any of the standard histories of the Cold War. The U.S. Has not focused on these things the way many Asian thinkers have focused on them. One of the Asian thinkers who focused most on this was Deng Xiaoping. And Deng Xiaoping looked around the region and said, why is everybody else doing better than we are, especially all the Chinese culture countries? I wrote a book and finished it in 1992, at a time when all good right-thinking Westerners knew that China was on the verge of collapse, including the CIA was telling then President Bush that China was about to collapse. And I said, the title of the book was The Rise of China, How Economic Reform Will Create a New Superpower. The reviews said I was an idiot. But what I could see was that China was emulating these policies of rapid economic development and peaceful rise, mainly by copying what had been done in South Korea and Taiwan, and secondarily in Japan and Singapore. It was a model that worked. Westerners couldn't see it. We were telling Gorbachev and the Eastern Europeans, go with shock therapy, put politics before economics. We give that bad advice all over the world, and we continue to give that bad advice. But the Asian model works. So the result of all these was an era of peaceful rises, an era when people were focused on economic growth and to make their people's lives better, to stabilize domestic politics, and to compete geopolitically. The way to achieve your goals in this kind of era is to focus on the economy. This is sharply different from what Western realist theorists say. They're very focused on military competition. It's totally different from what the interdependence theorists say. The interdependence theorists say if you're making enough money for each other, you give up your geopolitical goals. I'm saying something different. If you focus on the economics, you win your geopolitical goals. And South Korea versus North Korea is the best single example on earth of that fact. My concern is that this era of peaceful rises and forward-looking good feeling is eroding. And I think that's the real basis of the cycle of distrust that we are in now. And you can't abstract the U.S.-China relationship from some of the other things that are going on in the world, particularly what's happening in Japan. Japan taught the world how to do rapid economic growth and peaceful rise, and it has been the first to abandon that. But what happened in Japan starting in 1975 was that hubris came to substitute for the fear, the sense of crisis that had driven Japanese globalization and Japanese market reform. Japan turned inward. The story became not that it's reforms and it's globalization that have given us our great economic growth. The story became it's our traditional Japanese cultural practices that have created the economic growth. The cultural practices in question were things that were copied before the war from Hitler and Stalin in order to mobilize for the war. They had nothing to do with Japanese culture. And they only work in certain circumstances. Getting ready for a war, fighting for a war, recovering from a war, initiating economic growth, as happened in South Korea, Taiwan, China, and some other places. The interest groups took over. Japanese call them zoku, tribes. The retail, banking, agricultural, property, and construction groups are now so powerful that they can veto any potential leader. The only way that Japan can move its economy forward is by reforming, going back to globalization, creating more competition, getting those groups out of control. So what happens is any potential prime minister who would move Japan forward is vetoed long before he has a chance to speak out. And so each prime minister comes to power. He can't fix the economy. He talks about fiscal stimulus, monetary stimulus. That's have nothing to do with Japan's problem. And so after a year, eject 7 in a row now. Since Japan can't move forward, it has to abandon the story of growth and benefits for our people and mutual benefits to the region. You get 3 kinds of leaders. 1, muddlers who just can't do anything, get thrown out right away. 2, people who say we're going to restore Japanese dignity by rewriting the history of the past, by emphasizing conflicts with our neighbors. And this is Abe, Aso, Ishihara, Hashimoto. People are becoming more and more powerful. And they're provoking conflicts completely unnecessary with South Korea and with China. In Northeast Asia, most of these territorial waters issues are brought to life by Japanese kicking dogs that should be left sleeping. The third kind of Japanese politician also looks backwards. The DPJ's first prime minister, Hariyama, looks back to an idyllic village past that can be rescued by keeping inefficient post offices and reversing all of the reforms that Koizumi did to save Japan from financial collapse. All of these politicians are leading Japan into an eventual financial crisis and increasing troubles around the region. The United States is not innocent in this deterioration of the environment of peaceful rises and good feeling. Since 2001, American policies have shifted decisively toward primary reliance on the military. In the George W. Bush administration, for the first time in American history, so far as I can tell, every key foreign policy position was held by a person with military background. Secretary of State, the Deputy Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, across the board. The traditional uses of economics and diplomacy didn't disappear, but they faded. AID, where the AID representative in an emerging market used to be almost on a par with the ambassador. Now nobody's ever heard of him. And the resources there are negligible. And in Iraq and Afghanistan, the amount of money that was put into economic development was negligible. And control over economic development issues was taken away from the economic experts of AID and the State Department and the United Nations and put under the total control of the military. This affected the balance of American policies around the world in crucial ways. For instance, in the mid-2000s, when you had ascendant right-wing nationalists in Japan, this looked to the military people like a great opportunity. You know, these people want the things we want, so we can do more deals with them. And it was in 2005 that we first agreed to bring Taiwan under the U.S.-Japan alliance. It was in that era when we started promising publicly that we would defend the Senkakus militarily. We ended up enabling some of Japanese bad behavior and associating ourselves with a regime that was endorsing the things that the Yasukuni Shrine says, which are not particularly pro-American. The United States has also become an increasingly ideological power. Bush brought the military and the ideology trends together. He thought we could send the army into Iraq, and Iraq would be the first of a number of countries where we would turn the world into democracies using the American army. But for all the changes under Obama, a lot of things have remained the same. The National Security Advisor is a general. The key voice on Asia policy in the State Department is a great guy with a military background. The ideology comes through almost every time Hillary Clinton speaks. She goes to Mongolia, denounces China. She goes to Africa, she denounces China many times. And then she goes to Beijing and says, I offer to be an honest broker on the South China Sea issues. The U.S. hasn't gone from black to white. It hasn't. It's changed balances in subtle ways that make things much more difficult than they were in the past. Well, I come to China last quite deliberately because it's the accepted way of thinking in Washington to explain all regional problems based on the rise of China. And that's a catastrophically wrong way of thinking. By saying that, I do not mean that China the rise of China is not creating serious problems. It's creating very serious problems. As in the U.S., China's leadership has changed. It was led by in the early decades by cosmopolitan reformers, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Zhu Rongji. They studied South Korea. They studied Taiwan. They emulated them. I used to see Zhu Rongji fairly frequently, and he knew more about South Korea's development decisions than any American expert on Korea I have ever met. The detail with which they studied these things was remarkable. The current generation is not cosmopolitan. They haven't studied South Korea and these other countries in detail. I detect the same kind of fuzzy thinking about the balance between economics and politics that you get, and military that you get in Washington. It's not that they aren't intelligent like people in Washington. They're very intelligent, but they haven't thought this through. And so we're seeing a series of things that raise questions as to whether China is still on the path of peaceful rise and friendship diplomacy. I think we have to be very careful in our thinking about these developments. The Chinese have been growing their military budget more rapidly than GDP, which the US always notices. Every single year it grows it less rapidly than the overall government budget. That's a deliberate policy, and you never see that in the Western comments. China's claims in the South China Sea are not proportionally more unreasonable than Vietnam's or the Philippines or Malaysia's. The difference is that China is so big that people feel it has a responsibility for solving the problems, not just acting like a small country. Chinese officials have argued that in the past that when their colleagues call it a core interest, that this doesn't represent the views of the leadership. That's getting hard to sustain. Having applied a lot of these discounts, one has to say that China's South China Sea claims depend heavily on their claim to Scarborough Shoal, and that's extremely weak. Chinese Coast Guard is now surveying islands very, very close to the South Korean coast. It's hard to square that with peaceful development and friendship diplomacy. The use of economic warfare, depriving Japan of rare earths, depriving the Philippines of banana exports and tourists, is a step that's very different from past Chinese diplomacy. And China seems to conflate access to resources with ownership of resources, which drives policies that are very difficult. So, two things have changed. The quality of leadership has changed. It's changed most dramatically in Japan. It's changed in the US, which no longer can lead on global trade liberalization, is not going to have the resources to sustain its current military programs, is not going to provide, it's not going to go into any kind of absolute decline. It's not going to provide the kind of public goods that it did in the past. And China is seemingly on a different path. The greatest hope, I think, is that we publicize and understand, internalize the difference in the structure, the difference that is developed in the structure of the modern world. And the fact that each of our countries and the whole system will benefit enormously if we get back to this emphasis on a focus on common economic growth. And the greatest risk is that we lose that vision completely as a generation of leaders come in across the board. Incidentally, South Korea is the country that has most followed that vision, and it's South Korea's international stature that is rising faster than any other country in the world. Okay, so how do we get out of this? I think along with consciousness raising, we need some great common projects. We need some leaders who will educate people that we have to have a regional economic agreements that include the U.S. and Japan and China and South Korea. If we get together, that's a hard sell in Washington, bringing China into a trade agreement. If we don't, it's not going to work. If we do, everybody else in the world will follow. The second thing, huge mutual environmental effort. We fuss a lot with the Chinese about, we want quotas on pollution. They're doing more about pollution, investing more heavily than we are, by a mile. Somewhere in there we can get together. And finally, since we're here in Seoul, I think a new joint Chinese, American, South Korean effort to persuade North Korea to get on the bandwagon on a massive scale, something completely different from anything that's been tried. If we make 2 or 3 of these things work, we can get back on track. There's no inevitability in this, but we're off the track right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you.